Well, anytime it's my turn to speak, I'm always like, well, what do I want to talk on? I've got so many things I want to talk on, and I've got a notepad on my phone that if I think of something, it usually comes up during the daily readings. If I get a chance to do that, I'll just start, all right, do a talk on this. So, didn't know what I wanted to do. I read a number of them off to Katie, and she seemed like this one would be a good one to do. So, that's why we're talking about this. And you'll never guess what we're going to talk about. We are going to talk about, of course, this coming of Elijah. Is this something that is in the future still, or is this in the past? And some people might not even know, like, what are you talking about? A second coming of Elijah? I mean, where does that even come from? So, um, but there is a prophecy. It's in Malachi 4. It talks about, and this is actually the last two verses of the whole Old Testament talk about this, and we'll read it. Read it, of course. Um, but there are two basic thoughts on this, and one is that Elijah himself is going to come again in the future, right before Christ returns, and the other is that John the Baptist was the second coming of Elijah. And this gets to, I mean, there's so many moving parts with this. I mean, seriously, every talk I start, I'm like, well, this will be done in 30 minutes. And then I'm like, there's so much information that I mean, there's a lot of information I don't even include in this just because there's so much on it, but I have a hard time trimming things down. But this gets to who John the Baptist was, what he represented, but this also has a bearing on latter day prophecy, of course, too, because it's believed by many that Elijah is going to come before Christ comes. And so not only that, but it sheds light on the role of what John was to accomplish. And like I say, with any subject, you start looking at you got basically one question you're going to ask and try to find answers to, but you learn so many other things too that you want to include as well. So I want to share my findings on this and the testimony of the word. And basically, what we're going to do is very briefly review who Elijah was and what his work was, his removal from the scene, and the prophecy which indicate his future role. And then we're going to look at those along with what it talks about in the New Testament and about just other prophecies and how all these things seem to fit in or not fit in. And you might remember, I didn't look at the date, but I gave a couple of talks on Elijah years and years ago. And I very briefly covered the aspect of his second coming. Partly, I think it was because of time, but mostly because I didn't really have the time, I'm assuming, to look really deeply into this, but my view has changed since then. So what I'm going to say now is the opposite of what my conclusion was on this subject back then. And the evidence I used to support it back then was borrowed evidence in the fullest sense. Like I read something, it was in Elpis Israel, and like that makes sense, and like there we go. That's all I use. So, but looking at the actual verses and other passages, I see things differently now. So, and of course, I always want to try to go things to show, and not so much to tell things. So, like I said, lots of moving parts, but I want to try to at least share my findings on this and maybe provoke some independent thought on it. But let's look and start with just reviewing Elijah himself. I think most of us are familiar with him. I mean, his life and most of the things he's done are recorded from First Kings 17 through Second Kings 2. And his introduction is very sudden and bold. Like you've never heard of this individual before. And the very first time we see him, he's coming up before the king of Israel saying, "You've done wickedly. There's not going to be any rain according to my until I say so." Basically, um, out of nowhere, he comes from Tishbe or Tishbite. He's a Tishbite, they say. And it didn't rain for 3.5 years. So there's a lot of things he did in his life, of course, and God used him as a vessel to show his mighty hand, to execute judgment on the servants of Baal. And it seems that Elijah would have had a reputation for calling down fire from heaven. I mean, in no less than three occasions, he does this. So if Elijah's coming up against an enemy, you almost know there's going to be some fire coming from this guy and consuming some people. Um, but he's very recognizable as well because he wore these hairy garments. When it says in 2 Kings 1:7 and 8 says he was an hairy man, doesn't mean that he was like he had a beard. And of course, he probably had a beard, but when you look it up, it means that he wore lots of hair. So this is most likely camel's hair is what he wore, and he had a leather girdle. Like that was kind of like me. I have like two outfits. He had one. Seems like. Um, and in one instance, Elijah had sent a message to Ahaziah, who's a king in Israel, and he sent this message through a man that did not know who Elijah was. So Ahaziah questions this messenger and says, And he, Ahaziah, said unto them, What manner of man was he which came up to meet you and told you these words? And they answered him, Well, he was a hairy man, or he had this camel's hair on him, and he had a girdle of leather about his loins. And Ahaziah says, It's Elijah the Tishbite. So just by his attire alone, everybody knew who he was. And of course, obviously, he's got messages from God. But he spent a lot of his time living in the wilderness and fleeing Ahab's wrath because, Ahab was blaming Elijah for not having rain for 3 years, but it was Ahab's fault, of course. Now, there's a lot of things God had him do, but you can kind of summarize Elijah's purpose is what he says in 1 Kings 18:37, which is turning Israel away from their corruption and back to God. But Elijah would not complete this. He would be removed from the scene prematurely, and the Lord commanded him to find another man named Elisha and anoint him as a prophet who would take his place. And I don't know if I have this up here. Um, do I? I don't know. I just put this together yesterday. You think I'd know what's on these slides? Let's look up 2 Kings 2, read verses 1 and then 11 through 17, because this shows Elijah's exit, and it's just as thunderous and sudden as his entrance into the narrative. So 2 Kings 2, verse 1, and then verses 11 through 17. It says, And it came to pass, when the Lord would take up Elijah into heaven by a whirlwind, that Elijah went with Elisha from Gilgal. And then it talks about he goes from here to here and there to there and leaves from this place. And then you look at verse 11, it says, And it came to pass, as they still went on, this is him and Elisha, they went on and talked, that behold, there appeared a chariot of fire and horses of fire, and parted them both asunder. And Elijah went up by a whirlwind into heaven. And Elisha saw it and cried, my father, the chariot of Israel, and the horsemen thereof. And he saw him no more. And he took hold of his own clothes and rent them in two pieces. He took up also the mantle of Elijah that fell from him, and went back and stood by the bank of Jordan. And he took the mantle of Elijah that fell from him, and smote the waters, and said, Where is the Lord God of Elijah? And when he also had smitten the waters, they parted hither and thither, and Elisha went over. And the sons of the prophets, which were to view at Jericho, saw him. They said, The spirit of Elijah doth rest on Elisha. And they came and met him, and bowed themselves to the ground before him. And they said, Behold, now there be with thy servants 50 strong men. Let them go, we pray thee, and seek thy master, lest peradventure the Spirit of the Lord hath taken him up and cast him upon some mountain or some valley. And he said, No, ye shall not send. And when they urged him till he was ashamed, he said, Send. They therefore sent 50 men. They sought 3 days, but found him not. So there's a lot of verses we didn't cover there, and there's a lot of mystery surrounding this account, particularly what's with some of the verses we didn't read. But it's nevertheless clear Elijah could not be found by man. And apart from one quick mention in the later passage, which we'll read, we don't really hear about Elijah until we come to Malachi 4, verses 5 and 6. So let's turn over to that. We'll actually read all of Malachi 4, but let's just read verses 5 and 6 as of now. There's only 6 verses in the whole chapter, so it's pretty short. The last book in the Old Testament. And this kind of seems random if you're just reading the text, just to mention, to throw Elijah in here. But it says, Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. And he shall turn the heart of the fathers to the children, and the heart of the children to their fathers, lest I come and smite the earth with a curse. So that's the end of the Old Testament. And it's clear Elijah was to come again before this coming of the great day of the Lord. And the question revolves around when this would take place, and we're going to dig into that. But first, I think it's very important to talk about what actually happened to Elijah, because by far the most prominent thought, particularly among modern Christendom and even among some Christadelphians, is that Elijah was taken into heaven where God is. And there's certainly a lot of problems with that, though. And there's so many details that are just overlooked with this, but which are very important and show the truth of it. So, but how he was taken away, what actually happened to him, has a direct bearing on whether he's literally coming a second time or not. Because if Elijah was taken up to God's abode and still resides there, that obviously indicates that that specific individual has got a role in the future. Because it's the same thing with Christ. Christ is on God's right hand because he's going to send him back. So um, there are, like I say, a number of first principle issues with this and a lot of assumptions that are thrown into it. And we won't talk about all of them, of course, but one is that all descendants of Adam are mortal, and it talks about the scriptures say it's appointed unto men once to die, but after this, the judgment. We're also told that man cannot exist in the presence of God and live, and there's clear verses on this as well. One big thing is Christ is the first begotten of the dead, and if Elijah was immortalized, which he would have to be in heaven in God's abode, then Christ is not the first begotten of the dead. And as we know too, there's a lot of big problems with that. That it's on the basis of Christ's salvation that others attained it. So nobody could be immortalized until Christ was. So, and Christ very emphatically settles this whole question of, did Elijah go to heaven? Christ says, no man hath ascended up to heaven. So that very clearly, I think, shows that, or at least Elijah is not in heaven, but that doesn't answer the question of what happened to him and where he is. So we have to assume that Elijah died like the rest of Adam's descendants did. If that's the case, then he was taken away from the scene in such a way for a specific purpose. But since he would actually be dead in the grave, this allows for a different view. And we have to be kind of concise, of course, for time's sakes. But we have very clear scriptural evidence that Elijah was simply taken away from Israel's view, where they couldn't find him, but not to heaven, and that he lived many years beyond this taking up. And the fact that he remained on the earth is certain. I'm going to show you how, and I'm going to try to go slow. Please let me know if this gets confusing, because with dates and numbers, and especially like this, we have a king in Israel and a king in Judah that have the exact same name. So it kind of gets hairy, but scriptures make it clear. So we have this chart here. On the left, that's the kings of Judah, and on the right, those are the kings of Israel. And in reference to that, 2 Kings 1, that's we read in 2 Kings 2, and Elijah's taken up. 2 Kings 1 records the death of Ahaziah. So Ahaziah, he began his reign in 897 BC. He died in 896, and Joram, which is another name for Jehoram, he took his place in 896. So 2 Kings 1, Ahaziah dies. Jehoram takes his place 896. Then the next chapter, this is when Elijah is taken up. So Elijah was taken up in 896 or shortly after. And then in 2 Kings 3, we have an important thing. In 2 Kings 3, we have these two kings here. We have Jehoshaphat in Judah, and we have Joram or Jehoram in Israel. And these two guys, they made an alliance, and they said, we need to inquire of a prophet of the Lord. And they send for Elisha. So not only does this show chronologically, 1 Kings 1, 2, and 3, that, Elijah's gone at this point, but they're not sending for Elijah anymore because they know Elisha is in his place. So Elijah's gone at this point. Now, Jehoshaphat would reign for, you see 25 years there. He would reign for a number of years, but when he died, he was replaced by this guy named, again, Jehoram. So same exact name, but this is a completely different individual that is ruling in Judah now, and he took the throne in 892. So now we have a difference of about 4 years between Elijah was taken up and when this new guy comes in, and it's to him that he receives a letter from Elijah. It's not Elisha, it's Elijah, and it's 2 Chronicles 21 verses 9 and 12. We're not going to read exactly what the letter says, but it says, then Jehoram went forth with his princes, and there came a writing to him from Elijah the prophet. And you can look the context up when you see this is Jehoram of Judah, not of Israel. So, Elijah's taken up around 896 BC. And between that and when Jehoram took the throne is 4 years. So now we have a minimum of 4 years between Elijah being taken up and this letter being written. But there's more to it. Jehoram reigned for 8 years. And if we say that, there's only 4 years span here, that's assuming that Elijah sends this letter the very same year that Jehoram takes the throne. So that's kind of unlikely. It's not impossible. But Jehoram reigned for 8 years. And so this letter could have been sent to him any time in this 8 year span. So we can add this 4 years from one Jehoram to the other, plus the total of 8 years of Jehoram of Judah's reign. Now we have 12 years. So this could be anywhere from 4 to 12 years that Elijah's alive after his taken away. And this actually, there's more ways to look at this to reach the same conclusion, but we can get more specific with this because in Second Chronicles 21, part of this letter from Elijah was that God's going to judge you, and part of that judging is God's going to send nations to come and rob them. But it also shows later that God smote him with an incurable disease, and this disease took 2 years to kill him. So Jehoram gets this letter, and it's only sometime after that this disease hits him, and it takes 2 years to kill him. So obviously, he didn't receive this letter in the last 2 years of his life. So between 4 and 10 years, a lot went by between Elijah being taken up and him writing this letter. So he's alive and well. He's just not playing that same role anymore, and that gets to why he was taken that way. And I think it would take more time to explain in depth. But I think we can sum it up by saying that it was done to teach a lesson and give the impression of having departed to heaven, because he wasn't doing his role bad, and for God to basically demote him and have Elisha take the role would kind of indicate that. But I think it's to give this impression that God took him away and God's going to send him later. And it's a very similar thing of what we read about Melchizedek. Yeah, I don't have a slide on this, but Melchizedek, we don't read a lot about him in the Old Testament, but in Hebrews 7, first 3 verses, it says that he was without father, without mother, without descent, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like unto the Son of God, abideth a priest continually. So obviously, we know that he had a mother and a father. He had a descendant and all these things. And many believe him to be Shem, which I agree with. But regarding Melchizedek, all these facts are not recorded in Scripture, and they're omitted for a specific purpose. And that's what Paul is saying here in Hebrews is we're not told about all these things so he could be a fit figure of Christ who would live forever, basically. So, certain things are revealed about an individual in a specific way to give an impression. I think that's why Elijah was taken how he was. Now, where was Elijah taken up? And this is actually more important than I thought it would be. But he was last seen. These are the verses that we skipped in 2 Kings. But verses 4 through 11 shows him and Elisha going from town to town, and then it shows them going from Jericho and then crossing the Jordan. And it's when they crossed the Jordan that Elijah was taken up. So you can see on this map, this is where Elijah was taken away. And it wasn't to God's dwelling place. So when it says it took him up by a whirlwind into heaven, it just means the heaven is in the firmament. He's taken up into the sky and he disappeared. Now, we don't know exactly where, but he was on the earth somewhere, and there's a lot of places to hide out there, I guess. But now, the import of this fact that Elijah is not in heaven, it also relates to the transfiguration, which we'll talk about later. Because with the transfiguration of Christ, we have Moses and Elijah who appear on the mount with him. And Christ is in a glorified state here. So I think that in itself indicates that, this was a vision, and Christ calls it a vision. But if Elijah's, people assume that he just lofted down from heaven to appear on the mountain here with Christ, but it doesn't say that at all, and that doesn't account for the fact that Moses' death was recorded. So, but if you look it up, the word vision, which Christ says, tell the vision to no man about the transfiguration. If you look it up and where it's used, do I have this? No, I don't. Man, I didn't put a lot of slides in here. It's the same word that's used to when God told Ananias that, hey, Paul, I just smote him with blindness. I've given him a vision of you coming to give him his sight. Paul's blind and he's seeing stuff. So that's a divine vision, is like it's a divine vision. I don't know how else to say it. And then the other thing is when Peter was on the rooftop and he saw the sheet knit from heaven with all the animals coming down, that's the same word vision for that as well. So it's just a vision, and that explains how Elijah and Moses could both be there. Now, interesting stuff. Will Elijah himself come again? Now let's actually read this whole passage in Malachi 4 just to get context because we need to understand all these surrounding things before we can talk about this. And again, I'm ahead on my slides, so I'm just going to leave it. Now Malachi 4:1 says, "For behold, the day cometh that shall burn as an oven, and all the proud, yea, all that do wickedly, shall be stubble. And the day cometh that shall burn them up, saith the Lord of hosts, that it shall leave neither root nor branch. But unto you that fear my name shall the Son of Righteousness arise with healing in his wings, and ye shall go forth and grow up as calves of the stall. And ye shall tread down the wicked, for they shall be ashes under the soles of your feet, in the day that I shall do this, saith the Lord of hosts. Remember ye the law of Moses my servant, which I commanded unto him in Horeb for all Israel, with the statutes and judgments. Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet for the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. And he shall turn the heart of the fathers to the children, and the heart of the children to their fathers, lest I come and smite the earth with a curse." So, again, Elijah's obviously got a role to play. Um, and as far as like what the Jews expect, this has been a subject of horrible exploitation by the Jews. You know, since he was taken away from Israel, and this is even before Christ came on the scene, Israel has given Elijah such a prominent and fantastical kind of role. And we see that not just in the scriptures with what they thought of John the Baptist and what they thought of Christ, but we see this in history too and today. You know, when Christ was performing his miracles, the Jews thought that he was Elijah. In Matthew 16, it talks about that. When he was on the cross and he's crying out to God, they said, "Hey, he must be calling for Elijah to come and save him." And even with their feast, when the Jews have feasts and or specifically Passover, they leave an open seat just in case Elijah shows up. Now, there's so many other things, and John Gill, he's got an excellent synopsis of what the Jews have done with this and what they expect from him. And he says, and this is commenting on Matthew 17:10. He says, why then say the scribes that Elias must first come? And this is a question that the disciples asked Christ. And he comments, that is, come before the Messiah comes. For certain it is that this was the sense of the scribes, as it was of the ancient Jews, and is still the opinion of the modern ones. They say that in the second year of Ahaziah, Elijah was hid, nor will he appear till the Messiah comes. Then he will appear and will be hid a second time, and then will not appear again till Gog and Magog come. So there's three comings there. The third's obviously not scriptural. And they expressly affirm that before the coming of the Son of David, Elijah will come to bring the good news of it. And this, they say, will be one day before the coming of the Messiah. So one day before Jesus returns, or they don't say Jesus, they don't know who their Messiah is, but I don't know where they get this one day, but that's what they're thinking. As Maimonides observes, that there are of their wise men that say that before the coming of the Messiah, Elijah will come. So that's a very prominent thing. He's coming before Christ, or for the Messiah. Trypho the Jew tells him that the Messiah shall not even know himself, nor have any power till Elijah comes and anoints him and makes him known to all. And hence the Targumist often speaks of Messiah and Elijah together, and of things done by them, and in their prayers, petitions are put for them as to come together. And he just talks about how this is so backwards, and there's so little support for this. Where they make Elijah the Messiah basically. But it's important to understand that because especially when Christ first came, they believed all this stuff, and that'll explain a lot that we read about. Um, but yeah, we can see there's been a lot built around this, and a lot of it's simply garbage. But there's a second part to this. So the question really is this role to be carried out by Elijah himself or by one who would play the role of Elijah, like John the Baptist? And also, when is that to occur? Has this been fulfilled, or is it still in the future? And we have to exercise discipline in this because all the things I've read, or I say a lot of them, Malachi 4 is the only place where it talks about Elijah's coming again, and these are the things he's going to do. But then there's a lot of other prophecies that it's just assumed that applies to Elijah. And when you look at the context, I just disagree with a lot of it, and it doesn't make a whole lot of sense, or it doesn't fit within the context of itself. So, Well, let's break down what it actually talks about in Malachi 4 here, because we have things we have to define. And I think it is important that, like the ending of a lot of books, it's not just all one flow thought. It's kind of ending with closing thoughts. So the day of the Lord's going to come like this. Also, remember the law of Moses. Also, I'm sending Elijah. So that doesn't necessarily mean that all these things are connected together. I think they kind of are, but let's actually define some of these phrases here. So a big part is he's coming before the great and dreadful day of the Lord. And my mind immediately goes to the return of Christ. But there's actually two uses of this phrase. And it's either referring to the judgment on the house of Israel or the Jewish commonwealth or the future coming of Christ. Now, to know what it's referring to, you got to look at obviously the context itself and any other passages that refer and cite that passage, but also history. And to make it even more difficult, there's some passages where they have kind of a shadow fulfillment and then the actual. So that's something to keep in mind. But we'll actually see, I think, that this refers actually to the time of Christ and the judgments on the Jewish commonwealth. Now, this part was interesting. Turning the hearts of the fathers to the children and the heart of the children to their fathers, lest I smite the earth with a curse. It's kind of a strange thing, and just reading it like that seems to indicate unity among the people of Israel itself. It doesn't even seem to include God at all in here. But that's the purpose that Elijah's to be sent. And so anything else, any other prophecies that we're reading, and we're wanting to apply to Elijah, it has to align with this because this is his role. Now, actually, we'll read this in a second, but this prophecy or this specific phrase is cited in the New Testament by the angel Gabriel, and he gives it just a little bit different spin that it shows, I think, the true meaning of it. So we'll see that in a second, but let's first look at what I view as problems with Elijah's second coming as still future. And I write the prophecy letter, and I obviously try to read a lot of prophecy things. And the biggest thing I find is there's no need for this. I'm trying to figure out, where does Elijah show up? Like, where's his role shown? And it's just not there. I can't find anything. And when I look at the verses that are used to support it, I'm like, that's not what that's talking about. It's talking about this. Or here's some other verses that contradict that. So chronology is a big thing. So first, we'll just say there's a lack of mention other than this Malachi passage. But for those who conclude that Elijah has to come before Jesus, they'll say that John the Baptist was a type. He was a figure of this coming Elijah. Well, the figure has to fit the thing itself. So we have to say that since John the Baptist came before Jesus was appearing to Israel, then we have to say that John the Baptist is appearing to Israel, or I'm sorry, Elijah is appearing to Israel before Christ does. So that's an important thing. But we don't find anything or anybody coming to Israel except for Christ. And all of the evidence is the other way. I mean, so when we read about how Israel turns to Christ, it's when they see the holes in his hands, when they've been saved by him. You can read Zechariah 12:10, 13:6. I'm just going to flip over to 12:10 real quick, just a couple pages. But it says, and I will pour upon the house of David and upon the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and of supplications, and they shall look upon me whom they have pierced, and they shall mourn for him as one mourneth for his only son. And then for verses 13:6, this shows us their ignorance until they see the holes in his hands. And one shall say unto them, what are these wounds in thine hands? And then he shall answer, those with which I was wounded in the house of my friends. And it's when they see that they're like, that's Jesus. We killed our Messiah, and then they mourn and things like that. So if Elijah's role is to come and turn Israel to Christ before he returns, he failed, basically. There's other prophecies concerning this. In Isaiah 63, it's written from the position of somebody into Jerusalem as Christ and the saints are coming up from the south to save them. But it's posed in the form of a question. They say, who is this that comes from Edom? They don't know who he is. And this is right as they're being saved. So, it's not Elijah who causes them to realize and turn to Christ. It's Christ himself. Now, and then there's other chronological first principle things like, well, Elijah's not in heaven. He's got to be resurrected. So in order for him to be resurrected and judged and immortalized, Christ has got to come first. So that doesn't mean that he could necessarily send Elijah to do some stuff before Christ makes himself apparent to the world. But again, there's no indication at all in prophecy of that I find. Everything's the other way. So I've had these questions for a long time, but I'm glad I was able to look at this now because it's I don't like having nagging questions in the back of my head. So, and there's other problems that we just won't talk about for time's sake. But the question really is, as far as like the big stuff, is where do we go from here? If all those points that I just made are actually valid, then this Malachi 4 has got to apply to something. So, is John the Baptist the fulfillment of this second Elijah, or is he just merely a type of this? Because it's got to answer those questions. And I think there's two basic questions we need to ask. Did John do what the role of Elijah was to do without leaving anything undone? And if so, we can say, yeah, it's all buttoned up there. And then, are there any other prophecies which would make no sense if John was this Elijah? Because there's a domino effect on all these things. But as I say, when I look at other prophecies, I don't find anything that, well, if John fulfilled this, then, well, now we got all these big problems and things. So I find harmony, but let's explore this first thing. Did John do what these prophecies say he was the second Elijah was to do? And I personally have completely underestimated the greatness of John. I think we overlooked that a lot because when you simply read the New Testament, particularly not understanding like what the Jews expected, and kind of read or put yourself in that situation in the state of Israel at the time. I used to think like, well, what did he even do? What's the purpose of his coming? What did he even accomplish? And that's a totally wrong way of looking at it. And if we pay close attention to what's written, we find a different picture. And Christ himself even says, "Verily I say unto you, among them that are born of women, there hath not risen a greater than John the Baptist." So Christ is literally saying, John the Baptist is the best guy that's ever been born. I mean, obviously, I think we exclude Christ from that, but I mean, Christ puts a lot of importance on John and his greatness. So let's talk about him and see how are we supposed to look at him. His birth was very similar to Isaac's in that it was miraculous and that his parents were well stricken in years. And his father Zacharias learned about their coming baby by the angel Gabriel. He was doing performing his office when Gabriel appeared to him. And I think I've got this here. Now, so this is the prophecy in Malachi 4. And on the right, this is what Gabriel tells Zacharias. This is what your son's going to be and what he's going to do. And it says, "He, John the Baptist, shall be great in the sight of the Lord, and shall drink neither wine nor strong drink. And he shall be filled with the Holy Spirit, even from his mother's womb. And many of the children of Israel shall he turn to the Lord their God. And he shall go before him in the spirit and power of Elijah, to turn the hearts of the fathers to the children, and the disobedient to the wisdom of the just, to make ready a people prepared for the Lord." So this is what Elijah was to do. And that's where you see this. He's saying Elijah was going to turn the hearts of the children. That's what John's going to do. But Gabriel shows, I guess, a better meaning of this, or better translation of it, that it's a turning to God. It's a turning of the people, not just to each other, but to God. So this is a religious conversion here. Yeah, and this is the only other place where this prophecy is referred to. So, as we'll see later, John is doing this as the prophecies foretold. And if we look forward in Luke 1, a couple verses, we see that there are other prophecies that prophesied about him, and we're told what they are. And it says in Malachi 3:1, it talks about this man being sent, this messenger, to prepare the way of the Lord, and so on. And of John it says, "And thou, child, shalt be called the prophet of the highest, for thou shalt go before the face of the Lord to prepare his ways, to give knowledge of salvation unto his people by the remission of their sins." So there's the turning them to God, is in Malachi 4:6. "Through the tender mercy of our God, whereby the day spring on high has visited us, to give light to them that sit in darkness and in the shadow of death, to guide our feet into the way of peace. And the child grew and waxed strong in spirit," and pay attention to this part, "and was in the deserts till the day of his showing unto Israel." So he's not growing up like Christ was in Nazareth, in a town or a city. He's out in literally the wilderness growing up. So his way obviously is or his role was to prepare the way for Christ. And we see this other passage here with Malachi 3:1, and there's others that kind of say the same thing, but it's kind of puzzled many. Thank you. Why did John have to grow up in the deserts? Like, what's the purpose of that? Um, but this his role as the second Elijah answers this, and it makes it just incredibly beautiful. Um, and we see John appearing to Israel in the same big, bold way that Elijah did. Um, it says that he grew and he was in the deserts till his showing in Israel. And this is the first time people really even see John. And it says, now in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, the word of God came unto John, the son of Zacharias, in the wilderness. And then he came into all the country about Jordan, preaching the baptism of repentance for the remission of sins, as it's written in the books of the words of Isaiah the prophet, saying, this is the one crying in the wilderness, and so on. And all flesh shall see the salvation of God. So he's in the wilderness till God says, all right, it's time. I'm sending you to Israel now, just how Elijah received it. But in this passage in Luke doesn't really show the thunderous things he's preaching. But if you read or I guess a little bit in the next couple of verses, we see Elijah came with these big judgments and big statements. John's doing the same exact thing. And then it says, then said he to the multitude that came forth to be baptized of him, O generation of vipers. I mean, you imagine that? Like, you hear this guy out in the wilderness, and this is one of the first things he says is, generation of vipers, who's warned you to flee from the wrath to come? Bring forth therefore fruits worthy of repentance, and begin not to say within yourselves, we have Abraham to our father. For I say unto you that God is able of these stones to raise up children unto Abraham. And now also the axe is laid unto the root of the trees. Every tree, therefore, which bringeth not forth good fruit is hewn down and cast into the fire. So he's preaching destruction to those who don't turn to God, just like Elijah was to do, lest the Lord smite the earth, or if you look at the word earth, it's land, smite the earth with a curse. But there's more to this. So he's not just saying the things that Elijah was supposed to say. He's dressed as them. I mean, Elijah wore camel's hair. He was a hairy man, had a leather girdle. Matthew 3:4 says, the same John had his raiment of camel's hair and a leather girdle about his loins, and his meat was locusts and wild honey. So he's dressed as this guy. But most importantly, and this is the part that kind of blew my mind, he does all of these things in the same exact place where Elijah was taken up. He appears first in the wilderness preaching in. All right, so this is Elijah. This is where he was taken up, and then here's how we read about John. John appears. He's in the preaching in the wilderness of Judea, which is kind of a broad area, but we have more information. Where Luke 3 it says he came into all the country about Jordan, preaching the baptism of repentance for the remission of sins. So he's obviously by water. But this is where John's at. You can, if you can actually see that. I got my computer covering it, but it says early in his ministry, John baptized people right here. So he's in the same exact spot. So if you're expecting Elijah to come back, here's this guy in the wilderness, looks like him, saying the same thing in the same place that he left at. This is amazing, and it's the same concept that we see with Christ, because he left from the Mount of Olives. Do I have that on here? Maybe not. But what's even more amazing is Elijah. We didn't read this verse, but Elijah and Elisha, they crossed the river Jordan, and then he was taken up. John is baptizing people in the same place and in the same river where Elijah just crossed before he was taken up. So, I mean, the ties are just incredible. But there's verses which talk about Christ leaving from the Mount of Olives, and then the angels say in Acts 1, Acts 1 and in Zechariah 14 that he's going to return to Israel and set his foot on the Mount of Olives. So it's the same concept. It's beautiful. But, if you're a Jew in Israel, you're expecting Elijah to come before Christ, the Messiah, comes. This guy fits all the bills. And that's why, there's people that asked him, are you Elijah? And Christ answers this very question in the affirmative. Matthew 11:12-14 says, from the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven suffereth violence, and the violent take it by force. For all the prophets and the law prophesied until John, and if you will receive it, this is Elijah, which was for to come, or this is Elijah that was supposed to come. Then the disciples understood that he spake unto them of John the Baptist. Um, and then we have here in Matthew 17, his disciples asked him, this is actually after the transfiguration, why then say the scribes that Elijah must first come? And Jesus answered and said unto them, Elijah truly shall come first and restore all things. We'll talk about that later. Um, but I say unto you that Elijah is come already, and they knew him not, but have done unto him whatsoever they listed. Likewise shall the Son of Man suffer. So Christ says, yes, he's already come. I think what he's saying here when he says, the scribes have always been saying Elijah's got to come first, and Christ is saying, yeah, he shall come first and restore all things. I think he's just saying, yeah, well, chronologically they're right, but I'm telling you, he's already come, and they didn't understand who he was. And we'll talk about that verse more later because there's some questions with it. But now here's the interesting thing: Christ affirms John is this Elijah, but John himself says, no, I'm not Elijah. And it says, and this is when they came up to him and he's baptizing people. They asked him, what then? Art thou Elijah? He says, I am not. Art thou that prophet? And he answered, no. So Christ says, yes, this is Elijah that's supposed to come. And Elijah says, or John says, no, I'm not Elijah. What are we supposed to make of that? Well, I think it's pretty simple. I think John's just saying, I'm not literally Elijah. I mean, that guy's dead and in the grave right now. I'm not literally him. He's not literally coming back, but I am fulfilling his role. And that's the only way I can see that both of these things make sense, considering the rest of prophecy and everything else we know. So, yet he was coming in the spirit and power of Elijah. So, it doesn't really necessitate that it's exactly him that comes back, one coming to do his role. And I think the fact that Christ says, in Matthew, I think it was 7 or 11, he says, if you will receive it, this is Elijah that's supposed to come. That indicates that it's not something that's, I mean, as we can see, there's a lot of obvious natural things that say, duh, this is him. But, he's not coming and doing what they expected him to do necessarily. And so it took some thought to understand just how the Messiah didn't come how they thought he was going to, and it took some thought to understand. But I think John, like everybody else, actually, we read that even John was so, not misled, but he had expectations of what Christ was going to do, so much so that when John was in prison, he sent people to Christ saying, like, I know I saw the Spirit of heaven or Spirit of God descend on you, but are you the Messiah, or do we look for another? So even John, I think, like all the other disciples, they were looking for the kingdom to be set up then. But so it's just very ironic to see all the things that we read of what the Jews expect of Elijah, and they still missed him. Now, this is the part that I was like, well, how does this part fit here? It talks about Malachi, this smiting the earth with a curse. And there's a couple different ways to look at this. Like, is Elijah to come, to do so many things so God doesn't smite the earth with a curse? Like, there's not going to be any curse at all? Or is it, this is his role, and if they don't respond correctly, there's a curse, punishment? I would assume the latter, particularly from history. But, we know that the nation of Israel is likened to a fig tree. There's a lot of places that talk about this. And one important part is this word earth. It's the word eretz. And people really didn't know about planets back then, so there's no Hebrew word in those days for a planet. But this is the Spirit of God talking, and he knows, God knows there's planets, of course. So basically, whenever we see this word, most of the time it's referring to land, like, the soil, basically. And just you got to look at the context to see if it's the whole planet or the land, just like the land of Israel or something like that. But most of the time it's land. But Israel being likened to a fig tree, we read what John says. I mean, remember the prophecy, Malachi 4:1. Where was it? It shall leave neither root nor branch. So here's some chopping down and some burning here. And then John here's coming to people and saying, now also the axe is laid to the root of the trees. So this is, I think, talking directly, it's a direct reference to Malachi 4:1 and 6. Um, but saying that the nation of Israel, this fig tree, is going to be cut down unless you guys repent and turn to the Lord. We know there's talks about this fig tree being corrupted in Christ's day, and Christ smiting the fig tree because it looked like it had figs, but it didn't. So they had this outward appearance of righteousness, but they didn't really have the righteousness itself. Now, how does this actually apply to John's time? If I think we have to look at it as it's not just AD 70. I mean, it wasn't like just one battle that took place. The whole Jewish Roman War took place from AD 66 to 138, and there's a lot that happened. But we're not just looking for the nation of Israel to be cursed. It says, "I smite the land with a curse." And this is amazing. Look, read this. Like it says, this is just talking about what Rome did when they were besieging Jerusalem and the surrounding areas. It says the destruction of the land started with Rome. Josephus records that the Roman armies cut down vast numbers of Israel's trees and destroyed the forests in order to build siege works for their conquest. Legend has it that the Romans even uprooted the grapevines and took them back to plant in Italy. Not only were the forests cut down, but the large grazing herds of wildlife in Israel were hunted or driven elsewhere to find forests and grasslands that could sustain them. This only served to exacerbate the desertification of the land, and with no trees or root structures in place, the ground could no longer hold water, and unchecked erosion began. So, you might remember that Mark Twain quote is like, "This is the ugliest land I've ever seen in my life." All the thousands of years that it sat like that, it's because of this. So it's tied directly to them rejecting their Messiah. It makes wonderful sense, at least in my mind, with the prophecy here. Um, now, and that site's actually interesting because it talks about the history of the land itself and the agricultural that throughout the years. But the other question, what other passages does this fit? And we're actually kind of on time here. So there's a number of things I admit, of course, for time, but one thing is what many people call the second Exodus, because I don't have the Brother Thomas's explanation here. It's just a short paragraph of Elijah's role, but basically he says Elijah is going to be sent to disperse Israel, because Israel is a term supposedly only used of dispersed Jews. Um, and Elijah's going to be basically the second Moses. There's passages which talk about them appointing themselves ahead and coming back. Elijah's going to do all that, and he'll be the one to teach them about Christ. But there's problems with this. And first, this is not just the Jews in Exodus where they can go and one leader brings them out. Prophecy shows that they're cast from every corner of the earth. So to have one individual leading physically, at least in the same way that Moses did, is just not tenable. They're all over the planet right now. But Hosea 1:11, this is where it talks about that Judah and Israel would appoint themselves ahead and come out of the land. But when you look at this, it appears it's belonging to Christ and not Elijah, because there's all these prophecies that show that Christ, even David, my servant, he is going to be the shepherd. He's the one that's going to lead them, not Elijah. But it is certain that there's this. I mean, we can call it a second Exodus, but it's not going to be exactly the same as the others, and it's going to be even greater than the first, because there's prophecies which say people are no longer going to say the Lord God that brought them out of Egypt, but instead the Lord that brought them from all the nations he gathered them. Now, this is interesting. It seems that the Jews are summoned. They're not led like Moses. They're summoned by Christ. One passage says, "I will hiss for them and gather them, for I have redeemed them, and they shall increase as they have increased. And I will sow them among the people," which means just kind of like spreading. "And they shall remember me in far countries, and they shall live with their children and turn again. And I will bring them again also out of the land of Egypt, and out of Assyria, and out of Gilead, and bring them into Gilead and Lebanon," and so on. So this hiss, it means like a shrill or a whistle. It's like, I can't whistle with my fingers. I was going to try it. But, it's like, hey, getting attention, come this way. And there's another passage that talks about this where there's a calling that goes out, and they come. It says, "And I will lift up, or he will lift up an ensign to the nations, or a banner to the nations from afar, and will hiss unto them from the ends of the earth. And behold, they shall come with speed swiftly. None shall be weary, nor stumble among them. None shall slumber nor sleep. Neither shall the girdle of their loins be loosed, nor the latchet of their shoes be broken." So here they're coming on their own, but you note the similarity to the Exodus where God says, "When I brought you out, your shoes didn't wear down. You didn't get tired. They walked from out of Egypt to the Red Sea without stopping, not even at night. So there's a lot of ties to the second Exodus. It's just it's not what I think some people expect of it. Um, but and there's other things that it talks about. But last thing we'll mention as far as objections and things regards to transfiguration. I think it's pretty clear, hopefully, that Elijah's not in heaven, so this is a vision, of course. But the main passage to support the future coming of Elijah is actually Christ's discussion with his disciples after the transfiguration. Because that's when they asked him, why do the scribes say that Elijah has to come first? And Christ says, Elijah truly shall come first and restore all things. And people point to that and say, aha, see, Elijah's got to come back and restore everything before Christ returns. Big problems with that. First thing being that Christ immediately says, I say to you, he's already come. So we got to balance these things out. But the emphasis and the real question is, what does it mean to restore all things? And I think we have to say that this is not referring to all things because it's Christ's job to restore all things. It talks about the restitution of all things and then the regeneration of the Son of Man. That's Christ's job. So whatever this all things is that he's restoring, it's on a more limited scale. But given what we're told about in Malachi 4, it would seem to indicate that it's restoring Israel to a right mind, to a right expectation, like Elijah's job was to do at his first coming as well. So this is all things concerning like how Israel views Christ. And if you have time, I would recommend, we'll read this one, but Albert Barnes has an excellent explanation of what this restoring is. John Gill has a really good one too. He was a commentator from the 1700s. But we'll just read this one with Barnes here. And he says, and this is commenting on Elijah shall truly come and restore all things. He did not mean by this that Elijah was yet to come, for he tells them immediately that he had come. But he meant to affirm that it was a true doctrine which the scribes taught, that Elijah would appear before the coming of the Messiah. To restore means to put into the former situation. And you can see another passage for that. But hence it means to heal, to correct, and to put in proper order. Here it means that Elijah would put things in a proper state. He would be the instrument of reforming the people or of restoring them in some measure to proper notions about the Messiah and preparing them for his coming. Before the coming of John, their views were erroneous, their expectations were worldly, and their conduct were exceedingly depraved. He corrected many of their notions about the Messiah, and he was the instrument of an extensive reformation, and thus restored them in some degree to correct views of their own system and Messiah in preparation for his event. So I thought that summed it up really well. John Gill's got a couple other points, but it's the same tune. But basically, yeah, they're right. Elijah's coming first, but it's already happened. So I want to close with just a brief synopsis of what I find is the most scripturally supported solution and relevance for us. I guess it's possible in a couple of years I'll give another talk showing a different view, but it's what I all found. This checks all the boxes for me. Basically, that John was this coming of Elijah, and this we wonder like why does it say I'm going to send you Elijah the prophet, but it's not Elijah the prophet, it's John. Well, it's the same way that we read about all these prophecies concerning like David, my servant's going to do this, but it's talking about Christ. So it's this concept of manifestation. Christ is the David. He's the beloved of the Lord, but he's doing the things that David kind of did. Establishing the kingdom in Jerusalem, conquering and creating peace around their borders. All the things David did, Christ is going to do to a fuller extent. And it also includes this concept of manifestation that Christ came in the spirit and power of God, and they therefore say that he was God manifest in the flesh. He completely did God's will. Well, John came in the spirit and power of Elijah. So it's the same kind of concept. I mean, even from his very birth, he was doing the things that Elijah was to do. So he's not literally Elijah because God's working with... It's God's way of sending Elijah back while also working with the law of death that's over the race. Like, I can't literally send them back, but this is as darn close as you can get. So, and there's a chart I've got here. Basically, I think the easiest way to look at it is John's not Elijah, he's the Elijah. And this is from the class I gave a few years ago, but just all the different similarities, and there's even more that I didn't even add to this, but, there's all the things that they did were, there's very clear ties, but obviously Elijah's going to have a role in the kingdom age. Just like, and it's hard to even imagine. It's not just Elijah; it's David and Abraham and Moses. All these people in the same place doing the same kind of thing. It's hard to grasp, but I want to close with this last verse, which shows just the magnitude of our hope. And this is Christ saying that among them that are born of women, there hath not risen a greater than John the Baptist, but notwithstanding, he that is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. So anybody who's in the kingdom age will be even greater than this greatest man that was ever born. And that's a wonderful thing to think about. It's kind of hard to imagine the concept of from your very birth having to live the life that somebody's predetermined for you, like John. He grew up in the wilderness, had to do all these things. Um, in a way, it would also be kind of nice because you know what you're supposed to do, but it'd be challenging as well. But we have the same exact thing. Like we are reborn when we come out of the waters, like Christ says, and that's our job. We're supposed to do. I mean, not everything like Christ or that Christ did, of course, but we do have that same kind of job and role that John did. It's just we're trying to be like Christ and not Elijah.